I think it's fair to say that this topic was going to come up, especially since I've been talking a lot about pharaohs as Aku lately. This is, of course, going to be a multi-part series because it's too complicated a topic to really cover in just one 60-second TikTok video. To begin with, who was Akhenaten, and why is he particularly important to be discussing? Well, historians often refer to him as the heretic pharaoh because he made some fairly drastic changes or attempts at changes and reforms in Egyptian religion, including closing down temples of the gods and discouraging worship in other gods. Instead, he encouraged worship in the Aten, or solar disk. Now, of course, the people of Egypt were not okay with being told that they couldn't worship their gods, and because of that, it generated a lot of hatred against this pharaoh. But he's more complicated than that. So yes, it's a more complicated matter than is usually discussed. Now, in order to try and begin understanding Akhenaten, we have to understand where he came from. When someone was the heir to becoming the pharaoh, they were prepared from a very young age to take the throne. They were taught in all the things that they were going to need to know, how they needed to act, what was going to be expected of them, and so on and so forth. Akhenaten did not receive any of that because he was not next in line for the throne. His brother was. Unfortunately, said brother was killed in battle, meaning that Akhenaten had to replace him. Up until that time, Akhenaten was serving as a priest of the sun god Ra, and because of this, he had up-close experience of how the priesthood worked, both the good and the bad. Because remember, anytime humans are involved with something, there is the possibility of corruption. His religious reforms placed the Aten at the very top, above anything else. He then declared himself and his family as the intercessors between the Aten and the common people. It's often said that Akhenaten founded the first monotheistic religion, but that's actually not accurate. He knew that certain gods were just too popular to be completely merged into the Aten. For example, Hapi, as well as the gods Shu and Tefnut. While it's been argued that as manifestations of the Aten, this was still technically monotheistic, I disagree, as the idea of the gods blending and merging and being aspects of one another while retaining their own personalities as separate individual gods already existed in ancient Egyptian religious thought. He also made significant reforms to the art. Art of this period, which is known as the Amarna period, because of his new capital city, was much less traditional than those that had come before it. It was less formal and more intimate, with loved ones embracing, holding hands. This depiction is of Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and some of their daughters. Another thing interesting about Amarna art is that up until now, pharaohs were depicted as they wanted the people to think they looked, not how they actually looked, with quote-unquote perfect, unchanging stone bodies. But Akhenaten wasn't like that. He wanted accurate portrayals of his body, such as in this depiction of him and Nefertiti once again. Not only did Akhenaten deviate from the traditional way of showing a pharaoh, but he actually made it work for him. In this particular depiction, which unfortunately has been damaged by time, Akhenaten is holding hands with his wife Nefertiti. In the carving, his large stomach and chest are very prominent and look a lot like the way the god Hapi is depicted. In fact, Akhenaten often compared himself to the god Hapi. He used his well-fed body as a kind of demonstration to show the sort of abundance and luxury Egypt could expect under his rule, essentially showing himself as a flesh and blood version of the various fertility gods associated with the Nile and other bodies of water in Egypt. Although we now know that a good portion of the pharaohs were fairly large people, he seems to be the only one who used it to his symbolic and religious benefit. The other issue is that Akhenaten wasn't particularly interested in day-to-day politics, or in military conquest as his predecessors had been. These were important because, remember, ancient Egypt was an empire, and that's how the pharaohs kept it strong, along with protecting it from its enemies that would like to take their land back, or take some of what Egypt had. He was a great patron of the arts, and I think should be celebrated for that, but that's primarily what he focused on, instead of the other traditional roles of the pharaoh. Although one really cool and different thing is the amount of equality that his queen Nefertiti had. In fact, essentially, him and his wife were partners, which was somewhat unheard of, even in a civilization that had as much gender equality in the ancient world as Egypt did. To go a step further, from what we know, it seems that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were particularly close. Despite the fact that Akhenaten was pressured by his officials and advisors to take another wife, because Nefertiti had only bared him daughters, he resisted for a very long time, which was, well, again, kind of unheard of. It seems, in fact, that his primary motivation for being with Nefertiti was actual love, instead of something political or in order to produce heirs. Now, this is something that I can appreciate, and I'm sure that other modern people can appreciate, but it likely wasn't scoring him any points in the eyes of other royals and nobility. At the end of the day, I think that Akhenaten was much better suited towards being a priest than he was a pharaoh. I think he would have been happier too, honestly. So in conclusion, I think that Akhenaten was somebody who had good intentions, but the power sort of went to his head. He was never prepared to be a pharaoh, but rather a priest, and had this just pushed upon him by unlikely circumstances. I think that ultimately he wanted to reform religious corruption in Egypt, but he went way too far in the opposite direction. He was a great patron of the arts, and I love Amarna art. In fact, it's my favorite among Egyptian art forms. But in an effort to combat the corruption in the Temple of Amun, he put too much influence on the royal family as the sole intercessors between man and their gods. So I don't refer to him as the heretic pharaoh or hate him or any of the things you would think that a devout Kemetic would. Instead, I see him as a cautionary tale, but also as someone to be admired in their own right for the good things that they did.